Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. We have a major update to public health guidelines. The CDC says fully vaccinated Americans no longer need to wear a mask indoors or maintain social distance in most settings.
If you are fully vaccinated, you can start doing the things that you had stopped doing because of the pandemic. We have all longed for this moment when we can get back to some sense of normalcy. Based on the continuing downward trajectory of cases, the scientific data on the performance of our vaccines, and our understanding of how the virus spreads, that moment has come for those who are fully vaccinated.
CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky also gave the green light for Pfizer's vaccine to be available to anyone 12 years and older this week. Meanwhile, the Colonial Pipeline is back up and running. A cyber attack crippled the major fuel supply line, causing a run on gas stations. But at what cost? Several sources tell CBS News Colonial Pipeline did pay a ransom to the hackers who infiltrated its computer network. The White House issued an executive order Thursday to improve the nation's cybersecurity defenses. President Biden maintains he'd still like to discuss the latest attack with Russian President Vladimir Putin, despite saying this about the Kremlin earlier.
We do not believe, I emphasize, we do not believe the Russian government was involved in this attack. But we do have strong reason to believe that the criminals who did the attack are living in Russia.
Overseas, at least 80 people are dead after an escalation of violence between Israelis and Palestinians. President Biden spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu Wednesday. During the call, Mr. Biden expressed support for Israel's, quote, right to defend itself. On Thursday, the White House responded to comments from progressives who accused the president of not doing enough to condemn violence committed by Israel.
You know, in our view, rocket attacks from Hamas into civilian neighborhoods is not self-defense, so he certainly reiterated that, but also reiterated the need to move to de-escalate the situation on the ground. His view, and the view of our entire administration, is that the loss of any life, a civilian life, any life, is a tragedy, and that's one of the reasons that we are so engaged behind the scenes in this effort.
Finally, the White House is continuing to host meetings with Democratic and Republican lawmakers in an attempt to find common ground on President Biden's infrastructure and jobs plans. Despite a lack of measurable progress, the president says he's prepared to compromise. For more, let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns, Meridith McGraw, and Juana Summers. Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter. Meridith is White House reporter for Politico, and Juana is a political reporter for NPR. Welcome to you all. A lot to cover today. Caitlin, first off, let's talk about economic news. Republicans say the economic news out is a reason not to support the president's plans. What is the gist of the arguments being made right now by Republicans?
That's right. Well, they're pointing to last week's jobs numbers, which, of course, were vastly underperforming expectations. And their argument is that people are not getting back to work because they are receiving unemployment benefits. Republican-led states, we've seen this week, several Republican-led states have actually moved to cut off the extension of unemployment benefits that were offered in the recent COVID relief package. Their argument is that this will help people or move people to get back to work. Democrats, however, and the Biden administration have been arguing that that's just not how they see things. They think that there are several reasons why people are not getting back into the workforce, among them the issue of not having childcare, and that's why they are pushing their infrastructure package, which largely includes some of these measures. So both sides really taking very different approaches and lessons from the recent economic news, and we'll see kind of how that factors into negotiations, of course, over this big infrastructure bill.
Juana, let's turn to cybersecurity. The cyber attack on Colonial took down a pipeline through which almost half of the entire East Coast fuel supply travels. It's the latest in a number of attacks. What is the federal government doing to respond?
Yeah, so President Biden has now announced a new executive order that essentially is the federal government leveraging its buying power to force a shift in industry standards. This executive order does a couple of things. The biggest one is that it encourages private companies to practice better cybersecurity or risk being locked out of the federal procurement process. So any software that is purchased by the federal government now must, within 6 months, meet a new series of cybersecurity standards. There's a sort of self-certification process there. This executive order will also create a new incident review board that is modeled after the National Transportation Safety Board. And that is so that the government can learn more lessons from these hacking episodes. And another big thing that we should point out is that it also requires every federal agency to encrypt data, whether that data is being stored or whether that data is being transmitted. And we should just point out that while there is rightly so much attention on this recent ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, this is something that has been in the making for months now that the administration has been developing as part of its plan to really shore up the country's defenses.
Meridith, the situation in the Middle East continues to escalate. The White House says it's had some 24 high-level calls and meetings with both Israeli and Palestinian officials. They've appointed a special envoy. Why are some Democrats saying that is not enough?
Well, what's already a very prickly diplomatic issue for President Biden is now also becoming a political issue as well, as we've seen violence increase between Israel and Hamas, which is a militant group that the United States does not deal with diplomatically. The Biden administration has said that Israel has the right to defend itself from these attacks. And they're right now under increasing pressure from progressives in the party who say that they should also be going a little bit further and they should be defending the human rights of Palestinians as well. President Biden and the Biden administration saying that Israel has the right to defend itself and not bringing up Palestinians, that may not have been a controversial stance to take years ago, but we have seen the Democratic Party take a shift to the left on this issue, especially with some of the young guns in the party, people like AOC or Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And so far, Biden hasn't taken that shift to the left, but it does seem like that's increasingly where the party is heading in terms of support for Israel.
All right, we'll continue to watch that situation. Caitlin, back on infrastructure, let's talk about the president's plan. Republicans say that rolling back the 2017 Trump tax cuts are their red line, yet corporate tax increases are the crux of President Biden's proposal. In spite of all these meetings, are there any signs at all of progress?
Well, what you just outlined shows kind of how far apart the two sides are in terms of how to actually pay for this. And also, there is no agreement yet on what both sides agree is actually infrastructure. The Biden administration has been arguing that infrastructure is not only just roads and bridges and broadband and kind of physical infrastructure. It also includes a lot of social networks as well. I mentioned childcare as an example. Republicans have been insistent, and I was talking to Republicans on Capitol Hill yesterday about this being what they call, quote, real infrastructure, that they want to just narrow this down and really focus on investments in roads and bridges and traditional forms of infrastructure. So there hasn't been yet an agreement on what infrastructure actually means, and the bigger sticking point is how they will pay for it. So at the meeting today, the bipartisan meeting that Biden had with these lawmakers at the White House, he said to them that they need to come back to him with details about how they will pay for his plan. As you noted, he wants to pay for it with those tax changes. Republicans say they don't want to touch the 2017 tax bill, but they haven't really offered a cogent solution to how they would want to pay for their reforms. So that's what we're going to be looking for. Republicans also say that they want this to be more than just a photo op. They want to actually see some kind of movement here. And that's because, support for infrastructure is broadly popular. We've seen that in our own polling. We've seen that in polling across the country. So there is an incentive for Republicans to get on board with infrastructure reforms. What that actually looks like remains to be seen. And also, this isn't a situation where there is a ton of urgency being applied. With the COVID relief bill, there was that kind of sense of a deadline to meet. For this, that's the big question, is kind of what the timeline looks like, what the sense of urgency is, what the public pressure is. And
with you, thanks for joining us. We have a major update to public health guidelines. The CDC says fully vaccinated Americans no longer need to wear a mask indoors or maintain social distance in most settings.
If you are fully vaccinated, you can start doing the things that you had stopped doing because of the pandemic. We have all longed for this moment when we can get back to some sense of normalcy. Based on the continuing downward trajectory of cases, the scientific data on the performance of our vaccines, and our understanding of how the virus spreads, that moment has come for those who are fully vaccinated.
CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky also gave the green light for Pfizer's vaccine to be available to anyone 12 years and older this week. Meanwhile, the Colonial Pipeline is back up and running. A cyber attack crippled the major fuel supply line, causing a run on gas stations.
Bipartisanship, they want to move forward, but there's also, frankly, the reality of the calendar on Capitol Hill. As Caitlin and others have reported, there are a number of priorities that President Biden is seeking out right now. There are these two large infrastructure plans that he has put out. There's also the pressure that he has put on congressional lawmakers to find some sort of a compromise on policing, legislation that he said he wants to be able to sign by the first anniversary of George Floyd's killing, which comes on May 25th. So not a lot of time to get that done. So there's certainly a lot of things that are on the president's wish list for these lawmakers. But legislative time is frankly very, very short.
Right. Switching gears, Meridith, Politico was first to report that law enforcement officials in Florida are discussing contingency plans for a possible indictment of former President Trump. Why now, and what obstacles would they face?
Yeah, it was really an eyebrow-raising story from my colleagues in Playbook this morning that Palm Beach law enforcement officials are looking into what they might have to do if former President Donald Trump was in fact indicted by the Manhattan DA while he's living down there at his private resort in Palm Beach. And among the things that they're preparing for is a possible interstate extradition. And it was notable that they said that there's a Florida law that the governor could step in that case. And of course, in Florida, there's Governor Ron DeSantis, who is a big ally of President Trump. But, if Donald Trump moves on up to Bedminster, which he's planning to do soon, he faces a similar law in New Jersey, but a less friendly governor there. He's been no fan of Donald Trump. But really, this is all a bunch of what ifs. There is, of course, ongoing investigations into Trump and the Trump organization's banking and tax practices. They're looking into things like tax fraud. But the timing of this is interesting because the Manhattan DA did make it clear that he's planning to step down at the end of his term. So there is a possibility that we could see some movement on these cases before the end of the year, making the Palm Beach law enforcement's planning something they actually did have to think about.
Yeah, Meredith, you called it eyebrow raising. That's exactly what I thought when I read that story this morning. Caitlin, finally, during a House hearing on the Capitol riot Wednesday, Republican Congressman Andrew Clyde compared the deadly attack by Trump supporters to, quote, a normal tourist visit. Hours earlier, Congresswoman Liz Cheney was removed from GOP leadership for challenging former President Trump's falsehoods about election fraud. What does that say about the party?
Well, as much as Republican leaders on Capitol Hill say that they want to move on, and leader Kevin McCarthy had said that the move to oust Cheney was, in effect, a way to do that, that is just not the reality within the party right now. I mean, you mentioned that there was this hearing yesterday on the attacks on the Capitol. Meanwhile, at the same time, Liz Cheney was being removed from her position for speaking the truth about what happened that day and the former president's involvement of it, and the congressman's statement there at that meeting is just flat out false. We've all seen the video, and of course there have been hundreds of arrests, and the facts are clearly the facts there. But this comes at a time where, you know, as the party is trying to figure out how to win back power in Washington, they still have the former president weighing in every week, sometimes several times a week, even today, claiming that the election was rigged and fraudulent, which we know is just not true. So he's been pushing these lies essentially nearly every week. You have in our own polling about 70% of Republicans saying that they don't think Biden was the legitimate winner of the election. You have efforts underway in the state legislatures to reform voting laws in the wake of the 2020 election. You have this audit going on that has not been sanctioned by election officials in Arizona. So as Cheney had been pushed out by her party, you have a party really still very much focused on the past, even as leaders say that they want to move forward. The big question, however, is what is the constituency then for what Cheney is talking about? She made clear yesterday that she is going to find a national platform to be continuing to make her message clear. But when you have, you know, the backdrop of everything we were just talking about within the party, kind of how can they move forward on that? That remains an open question and something to watch as Republicans try to plot back to take back the House in the midterms.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Meridith McGraw, and Juana Summers, thanks to you all.